everyone, and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to be talking about the user registration. So you might be tempted to go out and create your own registration page based upon the knowledge that you've already gained throughout this series of entity framework and model views and controllers. But you're going to run into some problems when you try to integrate with the ASP.NET Core identity. And we're going to start to see some of the components that are part of that ASP.NET Core identity begin to get integrated with our application in this video. So we're going to start out by creating our view model, our controller, and our view, not necessarily in that order, but we're going to start to see some of those, like I said, the ASP.NET Core identity components get kind of built into some of what we're doing here with this registration page. So let's go ahead and hop into our Visual Studio Code window and let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new controller. So I'm going to go to my controllers folder, add new item, and I'm going to say an ASP.NET MVC controller class. Now I'm going to go ahead and call this new controller the account controller, mostly because all of the help documentation and any sort of walkthroughs that you might come across will typically call this the account controller. But I should mention to you that you don't have to necessarily do that. Sometimes what I like to do and what I prefer to do is split up the registration process into its own controller called a register controller. But it does perfectly make sense to have all of your login and your registration actions all inside of one single account controller. So we're going to go ahead and follow along with that same practice here in this demonstration. So it's going to be called account controller, and I don't need this index action, so let's just go ahead and remove that for now. And the action that we want to create here for the user is going to be some sort of registration landing page. So I'm going to go ahead and call this, I'm going to do a public iActionResult that's going to be returned, and we're going to call this action register. Now, right now, the user doesn't need to pass in any information to this register method because really, they're just an anonymous user walking up to try to register to our application. There shouldn't be any information they need to pass in just yet. And we don't really need to do anything complicated here either. We can just simply return the view, which will be called register. Now, that register view is, of course, going to need a form with some sort of information that the user is going to fill out and then pass back into a register method. But for right now, this is just perfectly fine. Now, as for that form that the user is going to fill out, one of the really good techniques to do is to go down here to your view model and create a new view model that's going to contain all of the fields that that user is going to need to fill out on that form. So we're going to do that first before creating our view. And I'm just going to call this the register view model. We'll go ahead and add that. And so we need to be thinking about what are the values that we want the user to be filling in on this form. Well, the first one, and probably the most obvious, would be some sort of string that is their user name, right? But before we get too far along with that, let me just show you something here. I'm going to go to the tables that were created in our Contoso database. And if I open up the ASP.NET users table, and if we look at the columns here, we'll see that there is an email column that is 256 characters long, and the username column is also 256 characters long. They're of the same data type, and they are the same length. And sometimes it's really just very nice and easy for us to use basically the same email address as their username. So that's what I'm going to do in this case. Instead of having the user set the username, I'm going to say an email address. Okay, and that's essentially going to be their username. Next up, we need their password. So let's go ahead and add that as a property here, string password. And now I'm going to add one more property here. And this one is going to be a confirmation of their password. And the reason why you want to do this is because when the user is filling out that password value on the form, they're just going to be seeing a series of dots. So you kind of want to make sure they don't have any chance to fat finger anything and get it wrong. And you want to compare by having the user enter the same password in both fields to make sure that the user really does want that as their password. Now, while we're in this view model, let's go ahead and set up some validation annotations here. So we're going to hit a new attribute on our email. We'll call the required attribute, because obviously, in order for a user to register, we need to have some sort of email address / username. And of course, this is not currently in our list of namespaces, so let's go ahead and bring in that data annotations namespace. And something else we can do here is, since this is an email field, we should probably go ahead and say that this is an email address. That's going to be another data annotation here. I'd also like to say that the max length should probably go ahead and be that 256 characters. That way, right from the get-go, we're making sure that whatever the user enters in here isn't going to cause a problem with what we have in our database. And then finally, I'm going to add one more attribute to this email property, and that is going to be the display name for when we decide to bring in the labeling of our view, and we start to label the form, the form inputs. We can actually kind of specify what those labels should say right here from within our view model. So I'm going to go ahead and do display name is going to be email address. Okay. Now, one other thing I'd really quickly like to point out is that you don't have to do your attributes in this format. I kind of like to do this comma separated list of different attributes, but you could very easily just go ahead and add your, like your email address attribute here, and then your max length here. If you like to go kind of vertical with your attributes, that's perfectly fine. But I kind of like doing this until I run out of space on my view. And if I do run out of space on this, inside of this code window, then I just make another line. Just kind of my own personal preference. It's really up to you. Now, as for the password, we should probably also make that required. Oops, required. And this is going to need to have some sort of minimum length and maximum length. So we'll do a min length, let's say of 6, and a max length of 2. Well, let's just make it 50 for now. And we can also set the data type to a type of password. And then finally, we'll go ahead and add another display, and the name is going to be password. All right. And since the confirm password is really the same thing, just go ahead and copy that and paste it here, but I just want to change the display name to confirm password. Now remember that we want the confirm password property to equal what's in the password property, right? We want to make sure as part of our validation process that both of these things are equal. And we could do that here inside of our account controller so that when this model gets passed into the next register method that we're going to create, we could do the validation inside of there and add it to our model state if we had some sort of problem. But instead, I'm going to show you that there's actually an attribute that already does this, which is pretty cool. We could just call the compare attribute, and on our compare attribute, we just need to state what is the other property that the value should equal, and that would be the password property. Now I can also state that if there's some sort of problem with this, then our error message should say something. I'm going to say the password does not match the confirmation password. You can say whatever you want it to say there, but that looks pretty good to me. So with our view model set, I'm just going to go ahead and remove and sort the usings to get rid of all those extra using statements that we don't need. And now that we have our register view model, or the view model that we want to use on our registration page, let's go ahead and create our registration page. So we need to go to our Views folder, and right now we don't have a subfolder under here for our account controller. So let's go ahead and create that first. We'll do an Add New Folder, Account, and then of course inside of our account folder we're going to add a new item, which is going to be our MVC view page called Register. Now let's go ahead and remove all this extra stuff that we don't need. And let's set our model to that new Register View Model. And that's of course this view model that we created just a moment ago. And I'm going to set an H2 tag here, which is going to be the header tag, to let the user know that they are on the registration page. Okay. Now let's go ahead and add the form to our view. And we'll just kind of add some space here between our form tags. I don't need the action because I'm actually going to define this using our tag helpers. So we'll do ASP controller is going to be the account controller. And of course the ASP-action is going to be our register action. So this is the action that we're going to post back to when the user fills out the form. And we haven't really created that yet because, again, this is going to be calling a post or using the post method. And right now, our register action is not expecting any sort of data to come back to it. And we want to keep it that way. We want it so that when the user goes to the register action, when they perform a get, it's just going to pull up this registration page. But then when we do post back to our account controller on a new register action, well, it is going to be passing in some information as part of a post method. So we're going to have to handle that in just a moment. But for right now, just understand that we might have to come back to this registration page if the user enters in some bad information. So to solve that, we're going to do a div that's going to be the ASP validation summary. Now, on the ASP validation summary, there's a few different options. You could do all, you could do model only, and you could do none. I'm going to go ahead and stick with all, so it shows all of the errors that the user might have. And next up, let's go ahead and start adding some of those inputs for the user to fill in their information. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a new div tag. And I haven't really gone over div tags at this point. They're going to be talked about much more when we go over Bootstrap and formatting the layout of your pages so that they look really nice. But for right now, just understand that divs are kind of like little containers for your HTML markup language, or just kind of nice ways of putting everything in some sort of compartment. And we're going to say that the label for the first field, the first input, is going to be coming from our ASP4, and that of course is going to be the email property. So that's going to be our label. And now we need to add an input, and that's going to be for the same email property. And finally, I'm also going to add a span tag here that is going to be the validation for specifically the email. So if there is something wrong with the email that they entered in, we want the validation message to show up both up here at the top as well as here individually for each one of the inputs. So now that I've got that, and instead of copying or instead of typing all of that out again, I'm just going to copy and paste that. And really I'm going to do that twice because I'm going to have the password and the confirm password. So we'll just do that. All right, and then confirm password. Confirm password. All right. And then finally, after we've got all three of those input fields, we of course need to give the user some sort of submit button. So we'll add another div tag here, and inside of the div we'll do an input, and this is going to be of a type submit, and the value we'll just say is going to be register. Okay, so we have our form ready to go for the user to fill out and register. Let's go ahead and save everything. Now this is going to post, this is going to do a post method back to our account controller, and it's going to look for the register action. And right now we already have a register action, but we want this one to be the one that the user comes to in order to pull up the registration page, not necessarily the action that gets called when they're posting data. So we're going to add the HTTP GET attribute on this register action, and we're going to add another registration action, or a register action. That is going to have a different signature here because it is going to be expecting some data from our data model, from our view model of this registration page. So we can just go ahead and say this is going to be expecting a register view model. I'm going to go ahead and say this is the VM. I'm having all sorts of fat finger problems today. And we need to bring in the namespace. All right. Now, remember how I said early on in the video that we would need to start bringing in some of those ASP.NET Core identity components so that we could integrate the actual user management stuff with our account controller. So that's what we're going to do here. But what we need to do in order to make this work, and I forgot to add that HTTP post, let's go ahead and add that attribute on there. That way we have a really strong difference here between these two register actions. So what we need to do is we need to bring in a couple of those classes that we talked about earlier on in other videos. And to do this, we're going to use dependency injection. We're going to inject these components into this account controller. So let's go ahead and do a CTOR in order to get the constructor method here. And it is going to take a type of user manager, which has a type parameter, which needs to be that identity user class. Okay, so identity user class, and we'll just go ahead and say this is user manager. And I need to bring in some namespaces here. So we'll do control period to bring in that Microsoft ASP.NET Core identity, and that doesn't resolve for our identity user, so let's go ahead and add that in. That's going to be our entity framework core. So we need to bring in those two using statements. Now the other class that we're going to need to bring in here besides a user manager is an instance of the sign-in manager. And that one also takes the identity user. We'll call this sign-in manager. And we need to assign these to some private variables inside of our controller so that we can use them down here in our registration. So let's go ahead and add a user manager property and assign the user manager parameter to that property. And I'm just going to make this nice and easy. I'm just going to hit control period, and you can see we can go ahead and generate a read-only field inside of it. So just hitting control period can go ahead and create that for us. We'll also do the same thing for our sign-in manager. And we'll just go ahead and do control period, bring in a read-only field. There we go. So the first thing we should probably go ahead and do on this register method here, that's going to be the post action for our user registration. So they've filled out the information on our register view. They're passing it into this register action. The first thing we're going to want to do is check and make sure that what they've passed in is good. So we'll do if model state is valid. And actually, we kind of want to fail fast here. We want, if it's not valid, what should we do? Well, if it's not valid, then let's just go ahead and return the user back to the view. And we'll pass in the view model back with it. Okay, pretty simple. And in fact, I don't even need these curly braces. I can put this all up on one line like this. Okay? So if everything passes, we're going to need to create a new instance of our user, okay? Because we need to get the information out of this register view model, and we need to create a new application user instance. So we're going to say new application user. And it looks like I need to bring in that using statement for our models. And we're going to set the user name equal to the VM email address, as well as the email address itself is also going to be that email address. And you could see, of course, we could make this different, right? We could have had two separate fields in here for our registration, one for email and one for username. But it just, again, it makes things kind of convenient to have both of those two fields just the same value. Next up, we're going to return some sort of result from an await call to the user manager dot create async method. And the create async method takes a type of new application user or identity user, which of course, again, our application user it inherits from identity user. So that's perfectly fine to pass in user. Now, one of the other things that we want to pass in there is going to be the password that the user wants to set for this account. So that's going to be the password. Now, we're getting some red squigglies here, and that's because this is an await call. And we haven't talked anything about tasks or async calls or anything like that, but essentially this is very simple to solve. We need to make the containing scope async. So I'm just going to use that light bulb there to just go ahead and do what it says and make it so that this is an async method. In order for this to work, though, I also need to say that this is going to not return an iActionResult, but rather a task of iActionResult. So we're going to fix that real quickly here. And now we want to check the result. So we're going to say if result succeeded, so if we successfully created the user with that password, then what do we want to do? Well, realize that we brought in not only this user manager to create the user back to our database, but we also brought in this sign-in manager. So if the user is successfully created, it might be a good idea to go ahead and log them in. And that's really what's happening here. This user manager is for maintaining the information with the database. The sign-in manager is for actually logging them in and logging them out. So let's go ahead and log this person in if they successfully created an account. So we'll do another await statement. And this is going to be the sign-in manager that we're calling. We're going to sign in async user. And for right now, we're just going to say, no, we're not going to persist the cookie that keeps that person logged in. Okay. We're just going to make it so that, they're going to be logged in this one time, and as soon as they leave the page or they leave our application, they're going to basically lose their login information. Now, what happens if there's a problem here? What if there is a problem registering that user? Maybe what we want to do is add those errors to the model state. So we would do something like model state, and we say add model error. So we're adding our own errors here, and this will then go to up here on our registration page in our validation summary any sort of errors that we might have gotten when the user tried to register. So like if they tried to register and their account already existed, for example, that would add a model error because the user already exists and you can't create two of the same thing. But what errors are we going to be talking about? Well, we can actually do this in a for each loop. So we'll just do a for each, and we'll call this error in the result errors. So when the result comes back from when it tried to create that user, it's going to fill in this errors list, and we could just iterate through each one of those and add each one of those errors then to the model state error list. So we'll go ahead and add error description. And unfortunately, we said up here, if the model state is valid, to return the VM. Maybe what we really want to do is make that return back to the view after it's already done this check. So what we'll do is, if it's successful, we'll redirect the user to, let's say, to the, just go back to the home page. We'll start with that. Index, and it's going to be the home page. Or I should say the home controller, excuse me. But if it doesn't work, then we want to go ahead and return back the view and the view model here. Now we just need to fix some things up here because obviously we don't want it to necessarily just do that there. We can just check and make sure that the view is good, and then we'll go ahead and run this bit of code. And really, we could just return the view model after this if is valid gets checked anyway. So we're just going to drop this down here. That way, if the view model is not valid, notice that we're saying if it is valid, we've got a call here already to redirect to the index home if everything worked out just fine. But if there was a problem, it's going to add all of the errors to the model state, and then it's going to return back to just our regular register view, and we're going to be passing in back that view model. So I think that this is probably going to work just fine. Having this if model state is valid is checking, and then if it is working, if the model state is good, then go through this process. But otherwise, if it doesn't, it's going to come out here to this return of the the register view anyway. I know we took kind of a surreptitious route to get here, but sometimes these are the things that you kind of do. You kind of talk yourself through ways of arranging this code, and you refactor the code to do different things. And it's probably a good exercise to see me actually kind of think through some of this stuff. So with all of these changes in place, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and test this out. So let's go ahead and run our application. Okay, so let's just go ahead and hop over to our account, register, and looks like we forgot to do something here. Unable to resolve service for type. I just kind of wanted to show you guys this error message in case you haven't seen it yet. This unable to resolve service for this user manager type, that is of course because back here in our setup files here, let's go to our startup. Down here, we forgot to add our different services and inject them into our controller class. Because again, remember, we are injecting this sign-in manager and user manager classes into our constructors of our account controller. Now it turns out that by using this identity user class, which is the interface class that we set up, right, or the interface class that's provided by ASP.NET Core Identity, what we're really doing is we're kind of negating some of what's already implementable. And what I mean by that is this identity user is not actually what we've set up here as our application user and integrated with add identity. So it turns out to solve this particular problem, And in case some of you guys ran into this while you were doing it, I just wanted to show you this. I can change it from identity user to application user. So this is the actual class that we're actually setting up our users to be within, not just an identity user base class, okay? And by doing that, by making sure that we're doing that, it will actually have a, it'll actually be able to discover for us, because we registered that application user class right here inside of add identity, that we should now no longer have that problem. So let's go ahead and run our application again. And now if we go to account register, it's going to be able to find it for us. So just in case you guys ran into that little error, I kind of wanted to show that to you, that you can still go ahead and go into your startup class and you can add those as services using the identity user class. You know, to add a transient or add a scoped is probably better to add scoped. But I just kind of wanted to show you guys that particular error in case you guys ran into it. You could just easily solve that by using the same class here in our add identity method call for our services in our startup class. As long as it's the same class name as what we have here on our account controller that we're passing in as part of the user manager and the sign-in manager, it will be discoverable by the ASP.NET Core Identity Framework. So just so that you guys could catch that. And let's put in for an email address here, steve@contoso.com. And I'm just going to use the password, just lowercase PASSWRD. PASSWRD. We'll click on register. And we can see that we get a problem here with a registration page. We see passwords must have at least one non-alphanumeric character, passwords must have at least one digit, and passwords must have at least one uppercase. So these are a set of default requirements for the password that are built right into the ASP.NET Core identity, okay? There is a place where you can change these requirements, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Instead, I'm just going to follow along with what these are. So I'm going to change this to capital PASSWRD 1 exclamation. So we'll do that, PASSWRD 1 exclamation, and that should go ahead and pass our requirements. And if everything turns out well, we get redirected back to the index page. And right now, we've registered that new account, and I can show you this if we go to the, let's go to the ASP.NET users. We'll just do a new, we'll just view the data here. We can see there is a new user now in our application. And the email address is steve@contoso.com. And the username is also steve@contoso.com. So I don't know if you guys can see that. Maybe I can make the window a little bit bigger. Nope, I can't make it bigger. I'm sorry. But trust me, it's in there. And I've got the user ID is a set of alphanumeric characters. It's a good there. We don't really have a birthday because that wasn't one of the fields that we passed along there. That wasn't one of the things that we asked. We don't have an email confirmed. That's something else we could do maybe a little bit later on in this series. But you guys can see that we've created this user now, and it's definitely in the system, and we're logged in and we're in here. But how do we know that we're actually logged in? How do we know that, okay, so the user's logged in, Steve's logged into this website, but how do we know for sure that he's logged in? Well, we'll talk about that in the next video here.
I'd like to give a special thanks to James McCoy for donating on Patreon so that this video could be made possible. If you too would like to donate, you can visit us at patreon.com/programmingmadeeasy.